I've had such joy reading your stories that I'm delighted that we can present you here at the festival in front of so many Scandinavian readers here. You've written a number of short collections of short story and one novel. I find it hard to describe what your writing is like if you should present it. How would you describe it yourself?
Uh-oh. That's very difficult. I guess I would have to say it ranges from the novel would be the longest, but even the novel isn't completely traditional novel. It's one sort of long monologue without chapters and just spaces now and then, ranging all the way down to the tiniest stories are only a line or two long with a title. And then everything in between, they're sort of prose poems and they're philosophical investigations, and there are, I've sort of adapted other writings from other people to fit what I think they might be, and sort of alternate form for them. I've done that a few times. So really anything and everything that I feel like doing, I do.
So you're not so preoccupied with what you call it, what kind of genre it is. You merely write.
I write it. I try to respond to the material. So the material comes to me, and I try to respond by writing it the way I think it should be written. And only afterwards do I worry about what I might call it. I mean, I call them all stories just to make it easier, but.
You were brought up in a family of writers. Both your parents were writers. They wrote stories for the New Yorker, among others. Can you describe how it was like to be brought up in this atmosphere of writing, and for you you weren't a writer at that time, but how was it like to the atmosphere?
Well, it was very stimulating and very interesting on the whole. I mean, we were in some ways a normal family with the normal harmony and the normal arguments. But the conversation was always very interesting. It wasn't boring. But both my parents were only minimally practical as you have to be to get by from day to day. So their great interest was, ideas, language, stories, and then also world events. I didn't inherit that for a long time. I was not interested in world events, but they were very interested in the news. All the children had to be quiet when the news was on. And language was always discussed in the house. Mm-hmm. That was just a huge preoccupation. My father was only a fiction writer for a while, and then he became an English professor of literature, and a literary critic. So he was always reading, always thinking about how things were written. And it was something they had in common, so it was discussed all the time. And language was discussed. So my father would hear an interesting word, and he would say, I wonder where that comes from. And he would go to the dictionary and look it up. Aha, it's from the Icelandic. So there was this constant interest in words per se. But they also had a sense of humor. They weren't pedantic, and they were interested in people too. Yeah. So.
That's nice. Did they encourage you to write yourself?
Oh yeah. I didn't do a lot of writing that I didn't have to do. There's some children who are busy writing their novel secretly in the bedroom or something, but I did what I had to do for school assignments. But I did them well, and there was a lot of interest from my parents. I would read aloud what I had written, and they would sometimes say, well, you need to get the rhymes better. The rhymes are weak. So there was a lot of active encouragement. Yeah.
And how did you begin writing what's more, real artistic, with a real ambition about becoming a writer?
Well, I think probably already in college. university, I took at least one writing course. There was no such thing as a writing major the way there is now. But I took one writing course during college and one after, or in a summer session in between. So I know I had some, I wouldn't call it very formal training, but at least I was. And I do remember reading in my last term of my last year of college, I read in a diary that I really want to be a writer, all I care about is writing. So at least by then it had happened. Yeah.
You said somewhere that you labored very much about your early writing. Could you say something about what was the laboring? What was the struggle?
Well, really to learn to write a good short story. It's not easy. It doesn't just come naturally. And
did you know already by then that it should be short stories that were your form?
Well, it was either short story or poem, but more likely short story. Sometimes I went through periods of writing poems, but I didn't really study that form as seriously and carefully. So the struggle was, that dialogue isn't good or that character doesn't see, all the traditional elements I was trying to learn to do.
So you were trying to learn the traditional narrative, and then somehow you found out it wasn't the way you should go yourself. You should go somewhere in another direction.
Yeah, but it took a few years, and then I discovered the writing of an American. He calls himself a prose poet or a poet, but I really thought of him as a writer of little stories, Russell Edson. Mm-hmm. And they were very strange little narratives, and not all of them were good. And that was very important because I had the example of Kafka or Beckett, and they seemed they could do no wrong. There was absolutely nothing of theirs that I ever read that I thought was not good. But here was someone who would try something that wouldn't always succeed, and I think that gave me a way in to try things that might not succeed.
You said that the short story called The 13th Woman was your first seminal story.
Well, I think of it as, I don't know if it was absolutely the first one, but it was in the first set of very short stories that I was doing.
Maybe we should start hearing it. There you are.
And at this time, I had set myself the challenge to do at least 2 of these very short stories every day, no matter what happened. So that way, I didn't have to get a good idea. I just had to do it.
How come you put up such rules for yourself?
Well, because if you wait for a good idea, you'll just keep doubting yourself. And if you force it, interesting things can happen because you're sometimes writing from a very strange place inside yourself. Because you can't stop and think, you just go ahead. So you can bring up very strange material. So it's... Yeah. And this is sort of one of those that brought up strange material or a strange psychological condition or something. The 13th Woman. In a town of 12 women, there was a 13th. No one admitted she lived there. No mail came for her. No one spoke of her. No one asked after her. No one sold bread to her. No one bought anything from her. No one returned her glance. No one knocked on her door. The rain did not fall on her. The sun never shone on her. The day never dawned on her. The night never fell for her. For her, the weeks did not pass. The years did not roll by. Her house was unnumbered, her garden untended, her path not trod upon, her bed not slept in, her food not eaten, her clothes not worn. And yet, in spite of all this, she continued to live in the town without resenting what it did to her.
This is almost one long sentence.
I think It actually is one long sentence.
Yeah.
It has commas and semicolons, but it has no periods.
No. But you could have chosen to tell this story in so many ways, but you chose this almost like a poem.
Well, also, I think I just wanted it to be relentless. You know, if you have a period and you start over again, it's a little less relentless. And I think if I analyze it after the fact, I didn't analyze it before, but after, I would say that it has to do with a young girl's feeling of invisibility, like I'm here, but somehow no one sees me.
Yeah.
I have no effect in the world. I'm not, you know. So I think that's probably what's behind it.
Yeah.
But I certainly didn't say ahead of time, I will write about that feeling in this way.
But since you found it a seminal, what did it do to you to find suddenly this form? You said it came from somewhere strange in you.
It was actually a great feeling of pleasure and joy and freedom and liberation, because I no longer was struggling with how to set the scene, how to start the dialogue, how to introduce the characters, how to make time pass. And all these things which are important and can be handled very well by a skillful writer, but I found them burdensome and difficult. And this was more natural to me, to go straight from, from the first sentence to the end.
So after this, the laboring became more joyful.
Yeah, really there wasn't labor. I mean, I still had to work hard at revising, and some worked well and some didn't work well, but it wasn't the same laborious kind of starting over and over and over again.
So this piece was written from a rule saying 2 pieces a day and just write. Yeah.
But of course I broke the rule. I mean, I would one day write 7. One day I wrote 7, because once you start, I was also very serious about, I had to go to the desk and I had to stay there for 4 hours or whatever. And so once you start, it's easier to go on. And I would transform things that were happening to me in daily life into stories immediately.
How would you do that?
Well, there's another in here called In a House Besieged. And it was based very much on, I was living in the country in France. I was actually a caretaker of a house. I didn't have much money, living in a borrowed house. And all around us in the countryside, there were hunters. We would hear shots. And so I just transformed what I actually heard into more of a fable.
So you take your starting point in actual real, what you see around you, and then you spin it into some kind of fictional
in that
form.
case I did, but in this case, this was written in the same place.
Yeah.
This is different.
Maybe we should hear A House Besieged.
If we can find it.
If we can find it.
Because I've been looking at old notebooks lately, and I can see that I wrote something leading up to it right before, and then I went right into this. And this is even shorter. In a house besieged. In a house besieged lived a man and a woman. From where they cowered in the kitchen, the man and woman heard small explosions. The wind, said the woman. Hunters, said the man. The rain, said the woman. The army, said the man. The woman wanted to go home, but she was already home, there in the middle of the country, in a house besieged.
Yeah. You said somewhere that you get inspired by talking to your neighbors. You live upstate New York.
Did I say that?
I think so. That you like talking to your neighbors and somehow get inspired from such everyday situations.
Interesting. I'm trying to think of a specific, the cows across the street were neighbors, of course, but that's a different matter. I did talk to them too, but they didn't answer. It's true that talking to people I know in the country sometimes. I mean, I've in a very different way. I've taken stories from things told to me by friends in the country, and sometimes get part of the story from one person and part from another, and then make it into a full story. But those are different from these early fable-like ones, because those are realistic. They are real stories.
Yeah. How can you say or tell when you hear something that it's something that you can use? Somehow one gets the impression that the language in your stories, it comes from some other language, from what you hear, and you are very much alert. You have different. You have ears everywhere. One obviously can hear. So, how do you tell that this is something that you can use? Do you do that consciously?
Well,
you write down in a notebook?
I do write things down in a notebook. I'm never consciously thinking I'm going to go out and look for material. But
No.
A very easy example to give you of this is that I was having lunch with my husband in a lunchroom not too far from where we live. So I had no intention of going there to get material. We were just having lunch. But there was a very talkative woman at the table nearby, eating with what looked like a friend and her mother, and then her own daughter or something. But she was one of these women who just dominates the table and talks. And I began listening to her because I had no choice. And then I began hearing that she was really telling all the things that were difficult for her in life. I mean, not just situations, but the first thing I noticed and really wrote down was she said, "I can't be alone." And then she said a few other, this bothers me, that bothers me, and this is difficult. And I think I was struck by "I can't be alone." But then she went on to say that when her husband used the chainsaw, she couldn't ride in the same car with him after he used it because the smell of the chainsaw gave her a headache. So the combination of those two things. So it's not that I've done anything with it, but it's really hard to, I had to write that down,
So you wrote a note about it, but it didn't turn into a story yet.
Well, that's still pretty recent, so, it's possible that I'll go back through the notebook and do something there.
Actually, you have one little story called "From Below as a Neighbor."
This was living in a different place. From below as a neighbor. If I were not me and overheard me from below as a neighbor talking to him, I would say to myself how glad I was not to be her, not to be sounding the way she is sounding, with a voice like her voice and an opinion like her opinion. But I cannot hear myself from below as a neighbor. I cannot hear how I ought not to sound. I cannot be glad I am not her, as I would be if I could hear her. Then again, since I am her, I am not sorry to be here up above, where I cannot hear her as a neighbor, where I cannot say to myself, as I would have to from below, how glad I am not to be her.
This is not an early story. This is written some 5-7 years ago. So how is the writing situation about a piece like this?
You mean how do I go about doing it?
Yeah, or it seems to be kind of a thinking and a note at the same time, clearing of a thought. You mentioned the philosophical approach. There's also a philosophical approach somewhere in this?
Well, I think it does start. I mean, a lot of these start from real life, and they're either a little distorted, they're not exactly real by the time I'm finished with them, or the narrator's not exactly me, but starts sort of like me. So it starts with a very simple perception, that we've probably all had, oh, I must sound awful, the way I'm talking right now. And but then I go through all the logic of it. I don't, so it's not really finished until I've explored all the ins and outs of the logic of it, So I end up with saying, well, I'm glad I can't hear her because I'm stuck with being who I am.
There's a similar story called Agreement. That's also from the same collection. Mm-hmm. Could we please hear that?
Yeah.
Page 199.
There were 3 that were written really to go together. I didn't put them together in the book, but I thought of them as going together. Because, oops, that's another thing that happens sometimes, that an impulse won't be exhausted once I've written one story. I'll need to write another 1 or 2 before I get rid of all the ideas, So this is, there's one, the other one is 2 pages later, Disagreement, so I could read the 2 of them. Yeah. This is Agreement. First she walked out, and then while she was out, he walked out. No, before she walked out, he walked out on her not long after he came home because of something she said. He did not say how long he would be gone or where he was going because he was angry. He did not say anything except, "That's it." Then, while he was out, she walked out on him and went down the road with the children. Then, while she was out, he came back, and when she did not return and it grew dark, he went out looking for her. She returned without seeing him, and after she had been back some time, she walked out again with the children to find him. Later, he said she had walked out on him, and she agreed that she had walked out on him, but said she had walked out on him only after he walked out on her. Then he agreed that he had walked out on her, but only after she said something she should not have said. He said she should agree that she should not have said what she said, and that she had caused the evening's harm. She agreed that she should not have said what she said, but then went on to say that the trouble between them had started before. And if she agreed she had caused the evening's harm, he should agree he had caused what started the trouble before. But he would not agree to that. Not yet, anyway.
Should we hear the other one, the Disagreement?
Yeah.
Yes.
And this is called Disagreement. He said she was disagreeing with him. She said, no, that was not true. He was disagreeing with her. This was about the screen door. That it should not be left open was her idea because of the flies. His was that it could be left open first thing in the morning when there were no flies on the deck. Anyway, he said, most of the flies came from other parts of the building. In fact, he was probably letting more of them out than in.
There seems to be, arguments or complications among couples. So that's the starting point. But it's also extremely funny. Are you also having fun writing? Yeah.
Oh, definitely. I do tend to see the funny side of things. Some things really don't have a funny side, but many other things do. So, most things.
Does the fun come in the writing, or does it come before the writing?
Oh, I guess it comes as soon as I perceive the funny side of it, and then the enjoyment comes in the writing. Yeah.
Because many of your stories are quite funny, but also you can easily feel it's serious content also. So there's these two poles in the story. Can you say something about how you work with stories in terms of not getting too involved in the emotional and keeping the form as clear as you do, because you actually the forms are often very clear.
Well, I think it's as soon as, I take the material from all sorts of places, or but a lot of it is from my own life and my own mind, because that's so available to me. It's there all the time. But I do mix it up with, material from elsewhere or from friends, from reading. But I think as soon as I recognize that this is something that I would like to write about, I immediately do distance it from myself. So even if it did happen to me, it could have happened to anyone in a sense. And then my project is to shape it so that it has a complete form. And in a way, it's no longer personal or no longer subjective. Once I shape it properly and give it the right rhythm and the right language, I think if it were more casually written, it would sort of cross the line back into confession, or I don't know, and it would be more uncomfortable. It would not be a finished made thing.
Another example of the same is the piece called Grammar Problems.
Okay, this is a bit longer. It's called Grammar Questions. Now, during the time he is dying, can I say, this is where he lives? If someone asks me, where does he live? Should I answer, well, right now he is not living, he is dying? If someone asks me, where does he live? Can I say he lives in Vernon Hall? Or should I say he is dying in Vernon Hall? When he is dead, I will be able to say in the past tense, he lived in Vernon Hall. I will also be able to say he died in Vernon Hall. When he is dead, everything to do with him will be in the past tense. Or rather, the sentence, he is dead, will be in the present tense, and also questions such as, where are they taking him, or where is he now? But then I won't know if the words he and him are correct in the present tense. Is he, once he is dead, still he? And if so, for how long is he still he? People may say the body and then call it it. I will not be able to say the body in relation to him, because to me he is still not something you would call the body. People may say his body, but that does not seem right either. It is not his body because he does not own it, if he is no longer active or capable of owning anything. I don't know if there is a he, even though people will say he is dead. But it does seem correct to say he is dead. This may be the last time he will still be he in the present tense. Or it will not be the last time, because I will also say he is lying in his coffin. I will not say, and no one will say, it is lying in the coffin, or it is lying in its coffin. I will continue to say my father in relation to him after he dies, but will I say it only in the past tense or also in the present tense? He will be put in a box, not a coffin. Then, when he is in that box, will I say, that is my father in that box? Or that was my father in that box? Or will I say, that in the box was my father? I will still say my father, but maybe I will say it only as long as he looks like my father, or approximately like my father. Then, when he is in the form of ashes, will I point to the ashes and say, that is my father? Or will I say, that was my father? Or those ashes were my father? Or those ashes are what was my father? When I later visit the graveyard, will I point and say, my father is buried there? Or will I say, my father's ashes are buried there? But the ashes will not belong to my father. He will not own them. They will be the ashes that were my father. In the phrase, he is dying, the words he is with the present participle suggest that he is actively doing something. But he is not actively dying. The only thing he is still actively doing is breathing. He looks as if he is breathing on purpose because he is working hard at it and frowning slightly. He is working hard at it, but surely he has no choice. Sometimes his frown deepens for just an instant, as though something is hurting him, or as though he is concentrating harder. Even though I can guess that he is frowning because of some pain inside him or some other change, he still looks as though he is puzzled, or dislikes or disapproves of something. I've seen this expression on his face often in my life, though never before combined with these half-open eyes and this open mouth. He is dying sounds more active than he will be dead soon. That is probably because of the word because of the word be. We can be something whether we choose to or not. Whether he likes it or not, he will be dead soon. He is not eating. He is not eating sounds active too, but it is not his choice. He is not conscious that he is not eating. He is not conscious at all. But is not eating sounds more correct for him than is dying because of the negative. Is not seems correct for him at the moment anyway, because he looks as though he is refusing something, because he is frowning.
That was a very strong piece, very beautiful.
I sometimes think it goes on a bit too long. I mean, it reaches a natural climax maybe, and then I just keep on thinking a little bit longer, and then it ends sort of abruptly. I don't mind the abrupt ending, but...
So actually, when you read, you think about it as a formal text also, not because the content is quite, heavy.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
I know. Both are in there. I mean, the emotion and the situation is all very real and difficult and human. But at the same time, in the midst of a situation like that, especially if you're a person who works with language all the time, you do have these funny questions like, well, he's not living. You can't really call this living. Yeah. So how do you answer that question? And so I start with one question, and then when I get into it as an interesting problem, then I begin asking the other questions.
Yeah. Yeah. And another story where you might say it's more light in its tone. Jane and the Cane, page 568. I think.
What is it? 500 and
68. Yeah.
Yes, it's an easier one.
Yeah.
It's old age, not death. Yeah. I don't know. I guess I can see where Beckett's influence keeps popping up, Exactly. Jane and the Cane. Mother could not find her cane. She had a cane, but she could not find her special cane. Her special cane had a handle that was the head of a dog. Then she remembered Jane had her cane. Jane had come to visit. Jane had needed a cane to get back home. That was 2 years ago. Mother called Jane. She told Jane she needed her cane. Jane came with a cane. When Jane came, Mother was tired. She was in bed. She did not look at the cane. Jane went back home. Mother got out of bed. She looked at the cane. She saw that it was not the same cane. It was not a plain cane. It was a plain cane. She called Jane and told her it was not the same cane. But Jane was tired. She was too tired to talk. She was going to bed. The next morning, she came with the cane. Mother got out of bed. She looked at the cane. It was the right cane. It had the head of a dog on it, brown and white. Jane went home with the other cane, the plain cane. After Jane was gone, Mother complained. She complained on the phone. Why did Jane not bring back the cane? Why did Jane bring the wrong cane? Mother was tired. Oh, Mother was so tired of Jane and the cane.
This one is even more like a poem because it's obvious that you enjoy the sounds and play with the sounds. So,
yeah, I like this one, and I think this too was born of a real incident, and you know, I reproduce the real incident pretty closely. But I think I wouldn't even have thought of perhaps writing it at all if the real woman who borrowed the cane had not been named Jane. So then it became, and then I realized I enjoyed it particularly because it reminded me of learning to read. And, you know, I learned from what we call the Dick and Jane books. They were always very simple stories with large type and very little vocabulary. Mm-hmm. So see Jane, run. Run, Jane, run. See Bob, run. Run, Bob, run. And educators think that these books are boring for children, but the excitement is learning to read, so they're not boring. I love them. And so I think those things came together, the incident, but of course also the personalities of the two slightly crotchety old women who are always going back to bed for rest. So it's the women and the incident and the rhymes and then the early reading books all coming together. Yeah.
You mentioned Beckett before, and actually you read Beckett quite young. I think you were 13 or something like that.
Yes, I know how old I was because I know where it was, and you know I remember it. But of course, that didn't mean that I began reading Beckett read all of Beckett's. No. You know, it's just that one I read the beginning of Malone Dies, and I was just very taken by it, very struck by it, and the simplicity of it, the repetitious language.
You also started copying sentences from Beckett, didn't you?
Well, much later, yeah.
Yeah.
When I was really studying, you know, how do you write a good sentence, or how do you write interesting prose? And then I would copy out sentences of not just Beckett, but I would analyze Kafka. You know, how does this begin? Why is it funny? You know, just a lot of analysis, which I tell students to do. You know, you don't even have to take any classes. You just analyze texts. You know, take a text that you think is wonderfully written and figure out why and what's going on, and that's really almost enough. You know.
Can you say something about what is a good sentence? Is it possible to say in general? No.
Well, it isn't really, because there's so many different kinds of good sentences. You know, they can be very short, they can be very long, they can have very Latinate vocabulary, they can have very Anglo-Saxon vocabulary. I guess the one thing I find myself doing sometimes, even with published work of other people, is cutting. You know, I say, oh, well, you know, she's got 3 adjectives here, and it's very clear from the first one what's happening. You can cut the other 2. So I often think cutting would be good.
But are you still copying sentences?
I don't copy. Well, I probably do, actually. And not because I think I want to learn how to do this, but if I come to a writer who's doing something that I think is sort of over the top somehow, extraordinarily interesting, I will copy out a sentence just to see how it works. Yeah. So I'm still doing a lot of certainly analyzing.
So how do you think Beckett influenced you when reading him from such an early age and then going through his sentences?
Oh, it's really hard to tell, but probably, it wasn't till I was just reading the grammar questions out loud right now that I realized that when I list, 4 different ways you could say, that in the box is my father, or those ashes are what was my father, that suddenly sounded very like Beckett to me, that he's in Watt, there's one long sentence, I can't reproduce it from memory, but not that he was glad and calm and happy, but that perhaps he was glad and happy calm, or glad and calm, or perhaps just glad, or perhaps just happy, or, and then without knowing it or something. So he does this with language, just patiently explores everything that can be done. And I always felt that there wasn't a single word wasted ever in his work.
It's also exploring through a rhythm in language, isn't it?
Yeah. Very much so. Yeah.
I can feel you have the rhythm also in your texts, and I know that when you were a child, I don't know if you still play the piano, but you were quite fond of playing the piano and also playing the violin.
I was less fond of playing the violin.
But you think you were influenced by music as much as literature?
I think I was very influenced, but it took me many, many years to see that, because I had studied music very closely, both music theory and both singing and piano and violin, as you say. And the violin was a struggle, but I was always told, well, this is very useful because you can play in a string quartet and you can play in an orchestra. But it was always very awkward. This position was very awkward, whereas this position was not. And but in all that training, you have to listen very, very closely. You're always listening. In the violin, you have to play in tune. With the piano, it's already tuned, but you're listening to other things, and I realized that that does train you to listen very closely, and it also gives you training in structure, because the music theory class, the teacher would say, here's the theme returning again, now we have the bridge passage. So you get a sense of structure, which can carry right over to structure of a piece of writing.
And you like structure?
Well, the structure has to be good and solid, even if, say, grammar questions, my physical sense of the structure is that it's sort of complete up to here, and then it dribbles off a little bit. So structurally, but now I accept that,
We're going to hear you read a few pieces from your recent collection called Can't and Won't. In there you have some different genre, one might say, dreams. You have some stories from Flaubert, some from his letters that you wrote into stories. You have lists, you have notes, you have letters of complaint. You have fables, also some kind of self-portraits, I would say, and some self-invented genre, of course, too. And I would like you to read the one called The Language of Things in the House. I don't know what I should call this genre, but it definitely sounds like Lydia Davis.
What do you have, a page number?
Yes, that's 219, please.
I don't know what genre it would be either.
No.
It's sort of a series of observations made over time the same way I wrote the cows, observations over time, separate observations. And so I don't know what to call it. And then there are passages of analysis, sort of, it's a little bit like a scientific investigation. Okay, here's what I hear, here's my theory about it, and here's more evidence and data, and here's more theory. So maybe it's a scientific investigation or something. The language of things in the house. The washing machine in spin cycle, Pakistani, Pakistani. The washing machine agitating, slow, firefighter, 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 firefighter. Plates rattling in the rack of the dishwasher, neglected. The glass blender knocking on the bottom of the metal sink, Cumberland. Pots and dishes rattling in the sink, tobacco, tobacco. The wooden spoon in the plastic bowl stirring the pancake mix. What the hell, what the hell? An iron burner rattling on its metal tray. Bonanza. The suction cup pencil sharpener being peeled up from the top of the bookcase. Rip Van Winkle. Markers rolling and bumping in a drawer that is opened and then shut. Purple fruit. The lid of a whipped butter tub being prized off and then put down on the counter. Horoscopy. A spoon stirring yeast in a bowl. Unilateral, unilateral. Could it be that subliminally we are hearing words and phrases all the time? These words and phrases must be lingering in the upper part of our subconscious, readily available. Almost always there has to be something hollow involved, a resonating chamber. Water going down the drain of the kitchen sink, late ball game. Water running into a glass jar, Mohammed. The empty Parmesan cheese jar when set down on the counter, believe me. A fork clattering on the countertop, I'll be right back. The metal slotted spoon rattling as it is put down on the stove, Pakistani. A pot in the sink with water running in, a profound respect. A spoon stirring a mug of tea, Iraqi, 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 Iraqi. The washing machine in agitation cycle, pocketbook, pocketbook. The washing machine in agitation cycle, corporate re, corporate re. Maybe the words we hear spoken by the things in our house are words already in our brain from our reading, or from what we have been hearing on the radio or talking about to each other, or from what we often read out the car window as, for instance, the sign of Cumberland Farms. Or they are simply words we have always liked, such as Roanoke, as in Virginia. If these words, Iraqi, Rocky, are in the tissue of our brain all the time, we then hear them because we hear exactly the right rhythm for the word, along with more or less the right consonants, and often something close to the right vowels. Once the rhythm and the consonants are there, our brain, having this word somewhere in it already, may be supplying the appropriate vowels. Two hands washing in the basin, quote unquote. Stove dial clicking on, Rick. Metal rug beater being hung up on a hook against the wooden wall of the basement stairs, carbohydrate. Man's wet foot squeaking on the gas pedal, Lisa. That's That's a part of it, that it goes on.
I have a quote from you saying, one of the impulses of writing fiction is to have some control over reality. The more I have shaped it, the more I have taken it out of myself, the more relieved I feel. I think that's very interesting. Could you say something more about this process somehow?
I don't remember that either, but because I often think that even though you think you write to get rid of something, you don't really get rid of it very far. It's still there. It's still there. But there
is it your urge for writing that you want to get rid of something? Maybe?
Not really, because I think the urge goes back to the urge to make anything. It's just to make it and make it out of language. So there is a certain pleasure in taking the sort of raw material that may be messy and difficult and shaping it into something. I don't know if you really get rid of that original messy stuff, but at least you have something made that you feel good about.
Yes, that's a satisfaction.
Yeah.
You have been teaching in creative writing, teaching young students. What if you should say your most important advice to young students? We have a lot of writers here today at the festival, and I know that many of the younger writers they really admire your work. So I know that they sit with their ears out, So if you have something you could say, just very, easy, so they really could. No, but what is the most important advice you could give a writer?
That's difficult because I take it seriously, advice, but there are several different pieces of advice, really. And what I said before about learning, you learn from models and you analyze them, you study them, you analyze them very closely. So one thing at a time. You don't just sort of read the paragraph and say, oh, that really flows, That's good. You say what kind of adjectives, how many, what kind of nouns, how long are the sentences, what's the rhythm. You pick it apart, and that's very helpful. Another thing I would say is to be very patient. And even patient with chaos. You have this beginning and that beginning and that beginning, and you're just worried and unhappy. But I wouldn't worry too much. I think it is a little chaotic. It's not neat. You don't start something and finish it, and there you go, and then start another thing and finish it. I would also say, but it helped me a great deal. Not everybody keeps a notebook by any means. Some writers somehow keep it all in their heads and bring it out when they need it. But I always keep notebooks, and it takes some of the tension and the worry away, because if you write it down, it may just be a note. It doesn't have to be the beginning of anything. And it also means that when you want to work on a piece of writing, you can go back to the notebook, and I have this beginning or that idea and this. So it makes it more relaxing. I don't ever start with a blank page. Maybe I did when I was trying to write these short ones. I did at that time. I said 2 a day, and So I had a blank page then, but I never do that anymore. If, for example, I hear the 2 women in the restaurant, there's a note, so I can go to that. So that keeps the pressure off. And the last piece of advice going out into the world would be, don't ever cave into the pressure of publishers, or agents who say, well, you've written a nice book of stories, but we need a novel now, And if you're not a novel writer, don't feel you have to write a novel. So do what you want to do, and don't worry if it's a little odd or doesn't fit the market,
Thank you so much. But we agreed that before we end here today, you will read a final text for us, which is not in any book. And you promised me that you would do the introduction of the text.
Okay.
So I just want to say thank you very much, and I want your reading to be the last thing up here. Please, Lydia.
Okay, this, have I lost the microphone? No, here it is. This has not appeared in a book or in a magazine because it's an ongoing piece of writing, because it's a sort of false biography or a false autobiography. It's at a certain point I started, again, I write everything down obsessively, so I started keeping track of whenever a mistake was made about me. And that broadened a little bit into times when I was addressed unexpectedly by a sign or something in what seemed to be a very personal way, oddly. So it's a few pages, but a lot of it is very short on the page. It's called Goodbye, Louise, or Who I Am. And it's the title's taken from a conversation in which I thought the person knew exactly who I was, but at the end of the conversation, she said, "Goodbye, Louise." So it has little section titles. My name: Linda, Lyinda, Lydia, Lyndon, Lyda, Lydea, Lydid, Lydia, Liddy, Lydiac, Lurdia, Lisa, Lisa, Louise, Olivia, Clydia, Slydia, Vidya, Videa, Lydia Clark, Lydia David, Lydia Davids, Lydia Davidson, Lydia Daves, Lydia Daves, Lydia Davis, Lynn Davis, Lindy Davis, Lily Davies, Lydia J. Davis, Ms. Lydia J. Davis, Lydia Vis 8353, Mrs. Davis, Mrs. Davies, Mrs. Lydia B. Davis, Mrs. Brooks Davis, Mrs. A. Lydia A. Davis, Mrs. Allen Davis, Mr. Davis, Mr. Lydia Davis, Mr. Lydia B. Davis, Monsieur Lydia, Monsieur Davis, Ms. Lydia Dange, Ms. David H. Davis, Professor Lydia Davis, Professor Davis. Dear Professor, Professor Tom, Dr. Davis, Sir, Sir, Madam, Ms. Douglas, Mrs. Coate, Mrs. Ciparelli, Mr. Onafuwa, Admin, ZL, Kadat Wafa Obuz Zawul Zaluk Bernu Wawuk, Heather. Where I was born, Nueva York. When I was born, 6 de Octubre 1947. Where I live now, Port Ewan, Port Ewing, Port UN, Port Ellen, Port Evan, Port Avon, Port Owen, Poet Ewan, Fort Ewan, Annandale, Cropseyville, Long Island. What I am: him, postal patron, the contractor, U.S. person, U.S. individual, the talent, payee, artist, bride, a party of one, GST, HST, the woman in 7, academic professional, half of Georgia's 1 o'clock, valued patient, interested passenger, non-Nigerian citizen, then wife, current resident, valued unit holder, unpaid beneficiary, designee, job seeker, another person sitting out there, a follow-up, a listener whose name begins with A through N, a small supplier, the intended, God's elect, dear, winner number 5, casual traveler, human visitor, librarian, very minor player. I have to take a sip of wine in the middle of this. What I might be, not Lydia. What I have, an existing business relationship with Yakimawea. What my job is, writer in residence at the University of Chicago. Previous employment, writer of film scripts, writer of subtitles for a Turkish sitcom. Position for which I am being considered, check assist manager, secret evaluator. Position I have been offered, regional representative of Seal Tech Machinery Company, manufacturer of packing materials and sealing machines in Taiwan. Stories I have written, socks, some trifle mistakes, autumn bugs, passing gas. Books I have written, Sketches for a Life of Wassily Kandinsky, Sketches for the Life of Vasily, Breaking It Down, Almost No Mercy, Samuel Jackson is Indignant, Samuel Johnson is Indigent, The Varieties of Disturbance, Verities of Disturbance, Varieties of Disturbance, Varieties of Disturbance, Varieties of Disturbacne, Varieties of Disturbing Questions, Disturbing Variances, Varieties of Experiences, The Collected Stories of Lydia Davis, Airlifting Horses, Can't or Won't, Can't, Won't. Plot description of my novel, Break It Down. It looks like an open and shut case when a London warehouse is burglarized and suspicion points at night watchman Jim Thorpe as an accomplice. Work in progress. Interview with Avital Ronell, Volume 2 of Proust's In Search of Lost Time. Awards I have won. Lannan Litway Prize, Shrinement Retreat Center Skit finalist. An additional fan of mine, the well-known rector, John Yates. What my work has been compared to, a walnut, pine boards, artist with whom I might be appearing, an experimental musician using a prepared cello. Event to which I have been invited, a small party for insiders. What I have been compared to, a cherry, a geyser, the horse's mouth. Questions I have been asked, do you have any smoke alarms in your home, yes or no? What they say I have, a passion for travel, quite an imagination. What they say I have had, a recent postal experience. Invitation received by me. To participate, please hang up your towel. What they say I could do, adopt a highway, adopt a rest area, adopt a visibility site, take home a free bowling ball, attend a free landlord training session, Switch to better motorcycle protection. What I might be, in violation for having a dirty sidewalk. What they say counts, my opinion. Friends of mine, Engineer Don Shishi, chairman of the tender committee. Miss Ruthie Copeland, female. Edna. Dr. Goodluck Jonathan. Other biographical facts, I am dead.